Welcome to the How to Draw Anything video guide. In this tutorial, you will learn how to literally draw anything using 4 simple phases. In this video, you will learn how to draw the figure using these 4 simple phases. The figure is often what people find the most difficult to draw together with portraits. So once you learn it for the figure, you can literally apply it to landscape drawing, still lifes, or whatever else you want to draw. Now, a quick note before we begin. You might see that this video is over 3 hours long. And that's because I always learned a lot from watching other artists draw and actually being able to see every single mark they make while drawing. That's why I left this video as long as the original drawing time that it actually took me to complete this drawing. However, if you look at the timestamps right below this video, you will be able to directly navigate to the parts where I'm talking and explaining to you what I do in each phase and why. So let's get right into the video. There are 4 phases to it: the sketching phase, the composition phase, the lay-in phase, and the rendering phase. And the point of learning these separate phases is because if you apply them, you'll actually be able to produce drawings of higher quality with much more consistency. Every single phase serves a specific purpose, requires specific drawing skills, and helps you solve very specific parts of the drawing. In my experience, learning about process is one of the single biggest things beginners can do when they start drawing to actually increase the quality of their drawings. Because most of them usually just jump right into the drawing, not realizing that they either skip several steps or that they're jumping around. And by having a process in mind, you'll actually be able to tackle the drawing much more confidently and also get the results you want much quicker. Now, before we begin, I'd like to let you know that there's also an in-depth written guide that goes along with this video on my blog. You can find it by simply going to the description below and clicking on the link there. All right, let's get into the tutorial. All right, what you can see is basically I laid in the basic figure drawing, and by using a ballpoint pen, actually you just also free yourself up to this idea that you can make mistakes because every mark you make is permanent, and you can very quickly get a bit of darker darks. So it helps you. It just helps you get a contrast going faster as well. So it's a great sketching tool. By having done this one, even though the proportions I'm not happy with, there's a lot of stuff that in the final one I will definitely want to improve. It allows me to get out my first impression of the drawing and already identify a little bit what I think will be kind of the centerpiece of the drawing. So I think what I will actually focus on in the drawing probably is this area here, because I think it flows quite nicely. It will essentially be the main form I want to emphasize is the light side here on the obliques. So yeah, I think the main focus will be essentially this flow of these three humps here. That will be the focal point that I'll create. And then everything else, that means this will be the point where we'll have the highest contrast in terms of edges, in terms of value contrast. And then everything else, I will essentially have less contrast. So yeah, and yeah, the sketching phase is also a chance to kind of explore little details, like for example this little overlap right here, and to just take your time to notice those things essentially, because if you have, once you've done that in this sketching phase, you just primed your brain to notice all these little things, and you also will remember them when you do your final drawing, and you'll just notice that much more on the second pass. So that is also yeah, one of the great advantages of just taking the time. You can see I intuitively changed some aspects of this this reference. I make the clothing, the bra and the underwear darker, etc., etc. Maybe I will do that in the final drawing, maybe I won't, but the point is a bit to be intuitive and to just explore the reference, because just exploring is always hard to do when you do a final drawing, because you obviously, if you make a mistake, it can be hard to erase, etc. And you ideally want to not make any mistakes, at least not any that you can't correct. So this sketching phase is a way of drawing, expecting that you will do some mistakes, but not caring so much about it. And it essentially just preps you for that final phase. So in the sketching phase, you also want to decide, as I mentioned, what's the focal point and what are the areas you'll probably leave much more vague. So for example, the feet here and the leg that's going in that direction, I won't really go into all these details probably in the final drawing. I'll try and keep that a bit lower resolution, a little bit more blurry, while this area as well spent most of my time modeling. I probably will make these pants darker than the reference, because I think it will create a starker contrast between around this focal point area, because it will be the brightest bright, and I will same with the head. I will probably just indicate it, and I'll try and really have this be the front. It's also what is relatively closest to the viewer, this whole area, while this is receding back into space. This is a little bit further away. The knee obviously comes forward. So that's a bit the idea, is then to make all of the other stuff recede into space by also making it um, by softening the edges, which reduces the contrast, um, by making it feel like it's part of the background, basically. That's the idea. And yeah, that is basically the sketching phase. And you can obviously, if there's any area where you are like, this one I really don't know, or how can I enhance this even more, you can, in the sketching phase, just develop certain areas a bit more, if you feel like it. Just the goal is essentially that by the end of it, you just feel very confident in your understanding of the reference and in how to solve most areas that are relevant for your drawing. And the advantage of doing this compared to just jumping in is that you will just make way less mistakes in the final drawing. It's also a fun part of the process because it's more intuitive, it's more free. You can really just use your emotional response, not care so much about proportions being perfect. You can explore little details and, figure out, do I want to add these little folds of the clothing, or do I want to not include that kind of detail? These are all then decisions that you essentially make already in this phase, that then you don't have to make in the next phase, because you already took the time to make them now. And yeah, and yeah, so that is the sketching phase. So the next phase is the composition phase. And while composition is a huge topic and obviously something you can study in a lot of depth, really the very basic basis of composition is just taking some time to figure out, how do you want to place the subject on the page. How does the subject relate to the frame? Do you, for example, do you want to use a frame that is more horizontal, or do you want something that is much more vertical? And where do you place the subject then in it? So that's like a very basic approach to composition, is to just figure out, how do you want to place the subject within the frame? What is the shape of the frame? And you can see I've done a little compositional study here, and it helps for those to just really reduce the subject into just some very, very abstract, simple shapes and forms, so you don't have to focus much on the detail. And then the main question is also, what's the focal point? Which, as I mentioned, I want this area of the drawing, so this one here, to kind of be the main focal point. So the goal will be to really focus on the form of that area and to model it, and have everything else about the picture support that story, or that read. So the idea is that here is the brightest bright, and that everything else essentially I try and design in a way that then brings that forward even more, that idea. And so here are some basic ideas that I'm thinking of applying to this subject. So first of all, even though in the reference you can see the brightest bright is even on the arm, I would say, and because the light comes from here, I actually will pretend like the brightest bright is really in this area. And while I might keep this area here still bright, like the shoulder, I will, I will keep it bright, but I will make it slightly darker than this area. So I'm intentionally adjusting values to bring up certain areas of the drawing. I also want this area to feel like it's forward, so I will try and keep the contrast the highest between light value and dark value, and also the edges and how much I refine that area. While I want everything else to move a bit into the background. So the whole upper body and the head, I will try and not refine it so much, but keep it a bit blurry and have it blur into the background to give it a stronger sense of atmosphere, the drawing. I might keep the highlight here on the knee, just so that there's a bit of a flow in terms of the eye movement. So you kind of see this form, and I might design it such that you kind of look like that. This kind of hatching makes your eye go here, and then I will design the background with a gradation. So the idea is that on the sides here I will have straight lines to make sure you don't exit the picture, but I will make sure the background gradation will be very soft, but it will be darker in the upper left corner, and then it will kind of gradate into the center of the picture. It will be a bit brighter in the middle and darker here. So again, it will capture your eye and guide it like in a circular motion through the image, and then arrive here. And again, on the right side, I will gradate with vertical lines to make sure you don't exit there. And then the idea is that essentially the eye flow gets back to that highlight here, and I still have to figure out a little bit what I do with the arm. So when we arrive here, again, there's a nice flow. I might just also create some kind of gradation so that the whole upper body and this part of the image is a little bit gradating into the background. And then the idea is that your eyes just flow a bit like that. So that's the idea of the image, and obviously the circle down here reinforces that kind of compositional idea. So it again makes sure you don't exit the image when you go down to the bottom part of the frame, but you keep moving up. So that would be like a basic compositional idea. Essentially, you look at the subject and you think, okay, what's my focal point? How do I want to arrange these basic forms in a way that brings up that focal point, but then also how do I want to guide the viewer through the image? And there really it comes down to abstract design, because you can see something like hatching here can just make your eyes go that way, and then by capturing them with more diagonal gradations here, it again acts almost like an arrow. It makes your eyes flow this way, and then you are designing how the viewer will look through the image. And yeah, just by taking a little bit of time to plan that, you can obviously, you can be very sophisticated about it. But I think just spending a little bit of time to think that through already increases your chances of having a better than average composition a lot. So it will already set you up for success. And it will mean that, again, it reduces your margin for error in the final drawing, because by now you would have already done the sketching phase, so you're much more familiar with specific parts of the image. You would have gone through the composition phase, so you have a clear feel how you want to design the values of the image, how you want to arrange the shapes, arrange the forms, what is the focal point, what should come forward, what should go back, and then how to guide the viewer through the image. And that already will make your final drawing much more likely to turn out great, because very often your drawings turn out badly because you start drawing and suddenly you realize, oh, a certain part of the image is really complex and I don't know how to solve it. So I'll just try, and then you make mistakes and you get frustrated. Or you might even be fine with all the smaller parts of the subject, knowing how to draw them, but suddenly you realize, oh, I haven't paid attention to where I place the figure on the page, and now it's starting to bleed into the next page and it looks bad. Or I haven't thought about the background at all, and now it looks a bit like the figure is hanging in space. And all of this stuff you prevent from happening by taking some time to have a sketching phase, taking some time to have a composition phase. And that's where you can really figure certain things out. For example, I'm still not 100% sure here on this side. I think it lacks probably a highlight here and maybe a smaller, darker highlight here, so that you grab a different eraser. But the idea is a little bit that have something that guides you through the image on the right side. So designing maybe that negative space, could be one thing as well. So you see that kind of improved a little bit the flow through the image here. These are the kind of thoughts, or the kind of thinking you have to do in the composition phase. And it's actually a fun exercise, because you can really think abstractly and you don't have to worry much, again, about the realism part of it. But it will in the end really improve your picture, and that's always the idea. So yeah, that's the composition phase. And I'll probably go with something along the lines of this one. All right, the third phase of any drawing is the lay-in phase. And many drawing students perceive that sometimes as the more boring part of the drawing, because you're confronted with a blank page. You have to measure proportions, you have to measure relationships between different parts of the subject. But what I would say actually is that in the lay-in phase, while it is important to measure and to get the proportions right, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, at the same time, actually, what should be on the forefront of your mind is the composition you planned in the previous step. So it's not just about now accurately drawing the figure, it's actually making sure it's placed correctly within the frame of the image that you decided on, and to already keep in mind the compositional idea you had. So to make sure that this figure actually is correctly placed within the frame and within the composition. Because you could obviously move it around. You could put it here, here, here. You could make it bigger or smaller. So that's already really important. And then also what you should pay attention to in the lay-in generally is the shape design. And what that means is that obviously for every shape you see here, you can make design decisions. For example, the top part of the torso. You could decide to simplify this area here into a straight line and design it in a more angular way, which can give it a different feel or different style than if you want it to read really organically by using maybe a subtle S curve, S and C curves, etc. So um, so already you're making decisions in how you design the lines, and that then impacts how the shapes are essentially designed. So that is something to pay attention to in the lay-in phase. You want to get the proportions right, but also the composition already set up properly. You want to already make design decisions. You want to pay attention to how the shapes you draw kind of relate and feel next to each other, how they connect, and just in general pay attention to these rhythms you see flowing through the subject that you're drawing, and make sure with every line you draw, somehow that line connects to all the other lines you made in a rhythmical way. So that in the end, the lay-in doesn't just feel like a bunch of lines laid in to measure something, but it actually already sets you up for a great composition, for great shape design, for great rhythms flowing through your drawings, because that's in the end what makes drawing so unique as an art form is that every mark you make shows a little bit where your consciousness was focused at the time, and by connecting it to all the other parts, you actually you're almost creating this interconnected web of moments, of focus and attention in your consciousness on this paper. And so the lay-in really is the phase where you can set up your drawing already for success and make a lot of exciting design decisions. And that's what I would say is something you should keep in mind when you start the lay-in. Now, what you can see is that I'm starting, I had the basic frame laid in, and now instead of immediately drawing the figure, I'm starting to put in a bit more information about the background, which is, if you remember the previous part on composition, is what I planned to do compositional wise. I wanted some curved lines here in the background as a gradation, which make the eyes flow kind of in this circle, keep it in the image. So I'm keeping the table here at the bottom, this round oval, and these parts here I'm inventing a little bit with the gradation in the background, and that actually is a great hack if you struggle with accuracy. Is this idea that the more information you add to the drawing, the easier it will be for you to judge if the next mark you make is correct, because you just have more to compare it to. So without all this gradation, if I would have now put in the head, it would be so much white space here that I would have to compare the head to. It's very easy to misjudge that, even if you draw a lot and you have a trained eye. While if I already create a bit of the background gradation, suddenly the space is much smaller, and it's much easier to make these little the next marks and judge if they're correct or not. And obviously it has the advantage that when I now start designing the figure, that every line I make, I can try and tie it in rhythmically with already the overall macro rhythm of the whole composition. So for example, when I draw the leg here, I can make sure I keep a bit in mind this line and this line, so that when I draw it, it will flow into it, so that it connects to the overall composition. So that's definitely a tip. In the lay-in phase, start with the background, and that's actually something you do in something that I learned from oil painting, specifically a la prima oil painting. It's where you try and complete an oil painting in one sitting. And a common way to start it is actually by focusing completely on the background with more abstract shapes, colors, etc. And you're trying to just start to slowly build up the background, and through that, slowly the figure appears, and you have a lot of information everywhere, and it makes it just much easier to slowly sculpt out the main subject from the background, and it makes sure the subject connects nicely to the background. And I would say another advantage of starting with the background is that it allows you to warm up your hand, because you don't have to be extremely precise by doing these movements, and it connects a bit more with your emotional side and with your sense for abstract design. So it adds a little bit of this feeling you might get when you sketch, this freedom to the drawing process. It starts it also on a very light note. It's not this, oh, I have to now be extremely accurate and measure this and measure this. Instead, you can focus on the abstract composition, the design, the rhythms, the emotions behind it, and at the same time set yourself up for more accurate measurements. So yeah, that's definitely something to pay attention to. the lay-in phase, what you realize, or what you're seeing right now, is I'm already somewhat mapping out the shadows versus the lights in this leg that's pointed towards us. And the reason is that these shapes of the upper leg and the lower leg, they're quite big. And so again, it can be quite hard to get these proportions right if you just focus on the outline. So it makes it actually easier to get this leg right if you start to put in a little bit of information about the shadow inside the leg, so that you don't just draw outlines around the form in your lay-in phase. You already start to at least indicate a little bit drawing over the form, which is sometimes called cross-contour drawing. And you can do that really softly. The goal really isn't to necessarily render anything, but it can already give you it essentially adds information to your drawing that makes it easier for your eyes to then see how the next mark you make relates to it. It can be little things, like, for example, below the knee here you have an occlusion shadow, so a very dark shadow created by the knee, by the leg kind of hitting the ground here and occluding this area from light coming there. And just by making that, indicating that a little bit in your lay-in, it can already create just a tiny sense of three-dimensionality that already just makes it easier to grasp a little bit what you already have and how the next mark you make relates to it. Because what many people do in the lay-in phase, they just use lines and they just map it out like that. And I find that can make it really hard to judge proportions accurately sometimes. Of course, you can always measure it literally with your thumb and the pencil, but I find a slightly more intuitive way of working is to add some information already on top of the linear stuff during the lay-in, because it just gives you more to work with and makes the process a bit more natural, a bit less procedural. And a second tip is to obviously use a pencil that's very light in the lay-in. I'm using a Faber-Castell HB matte, so it's a matte graphite that isn't very shiny. And what's great about that is that by staying light now, you can always erase it. You can always build on top. You essentially have committed to no value structure yet. So you can make anything lighter and darker, but you still have already laid a compositional base and you're laying a design base for the whole figure. So by staying light, by using a pencil that's very light, and by also, that's maybe the next tip, by not drawing with the tip so much, because that creates very hard edges. You just draw with an overhand grip. That might take a little bit of practice, but once you get used to it, it essentially just creates a slightly softer mark, which, when you think of edges on a continuum from hard to very soft, then the mark you can make with this tip is somewhere in between. It's maybe like a firm edge or whatever you want to call it. And from there, then later, it's very easy to extend the range of your edges. You can go in and say, here I'm going to make it sharper, and then say, here I'm going to make it much softer. So again, that's a great best practice for your lay-in is use a very light pencil, so you can correct mistakes and you're not over-committing, and also use an overhand grip, so edge-wise you're not already committing to sharp edges, which you want to reserve later for your focal point. So yeah, let's continue. Now, as you can see, as I've now filled in the figure, it's starting to hit the top part of my frame. And that's why it's always good practice to keep a little bit of space around your image. I probably should have had even more space here, so that when you need a bit more space, at least you can give yourself more space. And that way you increase your margin of error that you can work with, unless you're the perfect measuring guy or girl. It will happen. So my my impression is I should just raise it a little bit. Increase the frame of the image. I still kind of want the center to be roughly here. Now it's raising a bit, just so that it flows nicely into the main part of the image. So I might actually reduce it a tiny bit. We'll see. I can always erase and adjust it later. Yeah, I can. Oops. Make it a bit lower here. Create a bit more space here as well. And that's quite. Works quite well actually. Yeah. Yeah. Now you see it's actually I created the space and it's completely fine again. So again, that's a little trick where ideally, and that's the theme with a good drawing process, in my opinion, is that it allows you to be a bit more free and a bit more intuitive with your drawing as much as possible, while at the same time designing it such that you can get accurate proportions and a sense of realism. And where you're on that scale, whether you want to be the perfect control freak, have an exact process and just measure and copy, or if you want to be much more on the expressionistic type of drawing, that's kind of a question of preference. But either way, I think increasing the margin of error that you can work with by using a smart process is always a good idea. So yeah, definitely apply all the tips. Use a light pencil. Don't draw with hard edges. Give yourself space to adjust the frame, and yeah, design the rhythms and the shapes, and make them tie into the composition. So that way, your lay-in actually drawing becomes really fun as well. And fun is obviously an important part of drawing. How do you make it fun and not boring? And I definitely found it way more boring when I just would measure, copy, and just put in lines and angles. Because I personally always enjoyed this more organic sketching type of approach to drawing, but I also wanted to be accurate. So I think by finding the sweet spot between the two, it's actually quite a fun process, because it's pretty organic, but it's at the same time also gets you an accurate result. So yeah. And once you then go into the finer details, you can obviously start to hold it a bit closer and use more of a tripod grip, because you want to be even more exact with everything. That allows you also to get little transitions like this one, right? Which you just can't do when you work a bit more broad. So once you, and that's essentially where I'm at now in this one. I have the basic lay-in in, but now I want to make the lay-in even more accurate. And so I go in and I try and design the smaller curves of these different shapes. So for example, the shoulder felt a bit thick to me. So now when I go back in, I try and consciously design it to be a little bit slimmer, to fit with the overall proportions of the rest of the figure, basically. And again, always trying to be careful not to overcommit and still stay relatively light, so that I can always correct any mistakes. That's really important. What you can see is now what I'm doing also while I do this kind of second pass on the lay-in is that I start to slowly play a little bit with the edge quality here. So not to be super accurate, but just to add again by just manipulating the edges a little bit. You're able to already give the shape a little bit of a sense of form, essentially. So you're moving out of this two-dimensional world a little bit more into the three-dimensional space. And I want to get subtle curves like here. You see it curves down, then there's a curve like this, and then it's round again. And these subtle little curves also really add to the sense of form that you feel when you look at what you draw. And I find I can only get that once I hold it in a tripod grip and I get a bit more detailed. But if I would have done that immediately, it's very likely I would have gotten everything wrong, the proportions wrong, etc. So it makes sense to kind of do it on the second pass of your lay-in. All right, so I'm pretty happy with this lay-in because in the end, if you remember, I want the focal point of my whole composition to be this area here, the obliques and the side of the hip, and to basically model that form, keep it very light, and then kind of move the viewer's eye through the composition in this circular way. So I will keep the head just have it be indicated, same with the foot here, same with the hand probably. And I can always add more detail if I feel like it needs a bit more fleshing out later. But for now, I would say it's fine like that. Now what I'm going to do now, and that's always a good idea throughout the lane, and especially now before I move on to the next phase, is to once take a break, take a step back, look at the whole drawing from a distance, and for maybe a few minutes even, and give yourself the time and the space to identify mistakes. So that can be mistakes in proportions, maybe relationships, size relationships, maybe the torso is too big in relationship to the legs, etc. And also, I think it makes sense to develop your background a bit further at the end of the lay-in phase, because again, it gives you a lot of information as to how well you fitted the subject into the overall composition. So that's what I'm going to do now. I'm going to take a quick break, and I'm going to try and see what I can spot in terms of mistakes, and then finish off the lane. Right, having stepped back and having looked a bit at my drawing, the main thing I want to fix is the following. So I think this leg here should right now looks a little bit too graphic, too shape-like. It should instead be pointing in this direction and have a bit more of this form feel to it. You can also see it at this line here. Mine is a little bit too horizontal. So this whole thing should move down a bit and really point in that direction towards us. And that should also give me the space to correct the shape of the underwear, which it should be thinner here and it should be more space here. And pull all of that down a little bit, which I think would make sense. And I want to straighten a little bit also this, straighten a bit the feel of this backside here, so that it's not so so that it's not so at an angle. And I think then beyond that, let's see, I will also lay in a bit more of the background now. I will add a little bit of texture to the hair, I think, and then probably conclude the lay-in phase like that. So let's get into it. Okay, yeah, that is the end of the lay-in phase. As a summary, as you can see, it's somewhat dips into the form rendering phase for me. As I mentioned, I find it's much easier to have an accurate lay-in if you add in the background composition, the frame, and if you add a little bit of edge modeling and contour modeling, that you get somewhat of the feel for the form, and add a few cross contour marks. Um, then I would say that is kind of where I would say this is the end of the lay-in stage. I'm relatively happy with the proportions, with how the figure fits into the overall composition. I have a bit of a sense of depth and value already. And now, obviously, as I now go into the next phase, as you'll learn, I can still refine and tweak the proportions and the measurements as I render. In fact, that is a key part of the phase. So yeah, that's the lay-in phase. Once again, what do I recommend? It is to really focus on the composition at first, laying in the background, slowly laying information so that you have a much easier time judging proportions. Start drawing with a light pencil, draw with kind of soft dish edges, overhand grip, and then do a second pass of the lay-in where you refine a little bit already the contour and you model a little bit the contour and the form using a more accurate, precise grip, but still staying really light. Um, take a second to step back from the drawing, look at it from a distance, find things to tweak. Do that a few times if needed. Build up a little bit of value in the background, and then once you have a basic lay-in, then it's time to go to the next phase. Okay, now we're getting into the fourth step of the drawing process, which is the rendering process. And there are many ways to approach the rendering process. Some people, for example, like to now just go in and separate the lights from the darks by figuring out, okay, where's the separator line moving across each body part, put that in, and then start shading the whole shadow area. That's one approach, but what I actually want to show in this video is how to render keeping the composition you created previously in mind. And it relates a little bit back to the point that we also that you also learned about in the lay-in process, where many people use the lay-in process just to measure, while you can actually use it to design shapes, design lines, and already enhance the figure within the composition. It's a similar thing in the rendering process. Of course, you could now just render every detail, every form, but really what we want to do is enhance the focal point of the picture and the composition and the visual flow through the image with our rendering. So the game plan is that I will model a little bit the form of the focal point, which as you remember is the leg, the obliques, and the hip here. So, and everything else in the image, maybe a highlight on the shoulder, highlight on this leg here, on the knee, everything else will kind of be modeled such that it supports this focal point. My goal is that in the end, you kind of flow through the image like that. And you keep going like that. So as I'm rendering, I'm trying to keep that in mind. For example, the head. Of course, there's a separation between light and shadow on the head, but I'm actually going to blend the head into the background, because it is actually closer to the background, and that way I create a bigger feeling of depth, and I also don't distract the viewer from the focal point in the main image. And the head is not a part of that. So my biggest tip for the rendering process is actually to refer back to your composition, to the plan you made, how you want to arrange shapes, forms, and value to move the viewer through the image, and start refining the focal point a little bit, in terms of form, in terms of the edges, etc. And then once that's done, that's what I will do, is I will try and increase the value contrast. So I'll use a mix of a 4B pencil and maybe a 14B to make the background much darker. This will make the light stuff pop more to the foreground. And then I will try and increase the ranges of edges. So generally speaking, where the focal point is, you'll have much sharper and crisper edges, because it attracts the attention of the viewer. And then the further you move away from the focal point, usually edges become a bit more softer and a bit more lost. And by using these tools, value contrast and contrast in edges, you essentially can guide the viewer's eye, and you create also this sense of form that we're seeking. So yeah, I'll dive now into the process, and I'll stop here and there as I explain different concepts. So as you can see, I'm just spending time on the background. And just by making the background darker, you can see how slowly the figure actually comes to the foreground, because the dark background recedes into the shadow and the light figure kind of comes to the foreground essentially. And yeah, I'm also trying to pay attention to with each mark to reinforce a certain flow in the image. So I'm using curved strokes here, a bit of a mix here, etc., so that everything keeps flowing through the image. And I'm always trying to look at the image and think, where's my eye being directed by the way everything is designed, and is there any place where my eyes kind of get lost, and how can I close that and get it back into the image? So yeah, rendering really is about enhancing and reinforcing the composition in the image you're trying to make, rather than just rendering each little form. And I'm also using a makeup brush. Basically, I'm using these little kind of almost circular movements to just push the graphite into the valleys of the paper, which overall makes the tone smoother. And having a smooth, uniform tone is really important, because if you have a lot of white spots in your tone, your eyes can't really clearly read what tone is it. Is it dark or is it light? There are some white spots, then there's some dark lines. It doesn't read very clearly. And so it's very important that you try to get very smooth, uniform tones, because that's really the only way you can get an accurate value hierarchy in the end, where it's you have clear shadow areas, clear light areas, and clear gradations. That only works if your tones are actually consistent. Because if they're not consistent, it feels like the tones are constantly jumping around in one area, and it doesn't look nice, and it creates a lot of noise in the picture that you basically don't want. So now I'm spending essentially a lot of time building up the background, slowly building up a two value read, making sure my tones are really uniform, enhancing the composition, and I keep the focal point in mind. So I'll keep doing that for a bit, and then I'll get back to chatting when we get to the next point. So as you can see, now I'm going back into the figure and I started refining a little bit the contour line of the leg, trying to pay attention to where do I actually want to get a bit darker, where do I want to keep it light, because there's certain areas like here where you sense a separation of form, but it's super light, so it's very easy to get too dark there. So I'm trying to slowly build it up. And then in between, I can always use my brush, even a smaller brush, and that's kind of a soft watercolor brush, and just reinforce a little bit the flow of the form. And it slowly brings up the form in terms of feeling round. So it's kind of a continuous process of checking. Do I want to go in with my HB, a little bit closer in a tripod grip and refine a certain contour, or really delineate a little separation here that maybe isn't clear. So it's a lot about refining, like this little overlap here, for example, wasn't clear before, etc. And as I do this, you always, with each mark you make, you kind of get a sense. Does it make it better or worse? Does it make the figure pop a bit more, or not? Does it make it look more flat? So you kind of work yourself through it, and you can always make things a bit lighter again with a kneaded eraser, soften things up with a brush, or go in a bit harder again. And then obviously I'm now starting to put a little bit of more shadow into the actual figure, which so far I kind of avoided. And that is kind of where I'm at right now. And in terms of mark making, I'm constantly switching the position of the pencil. Sometimes I grab it close, sometimes I grab it very far and do something light like this. And I would just recommend experimenting with all these different grips and pressures as you go. Even sometimes you might want to turn your pencil a little bit to get the sharp side again if you want to make a sharper little mark. So you're constantly trying to get just the right grip and the right pressure for the mark you want to make. And then a lot of the form modeling is essentially imagining how it would feel to follow that form around with the pencil, and slowly building up the form that way. So instead of just hatching straight lines, you actually try and follow the form. That's a little bit the process. So you just continuously do that. You try and, for example, here I'm using a little bit of curved lines to make it feel a bit more curved, etc. And you keep building up the form that way. And always once in a while checking back into, what is the big impression of the image. I see right now this is refined, so I definitely want to refine the leg more. My goal is kind of to move through the torso down to the leg here, so this area flows really nicely, and then I'll take it from there and see how it looks. Maybe I'll then darken the background again, or look back into maybe reestablish the head a little bit. But really, again, the primary goal of the rendering phase is always refer back to your composition and refer back to your focal point. And as you bring it up, always try and see, does this create the eye flow that I want in the image? Does it create the pop and the focus where I want it to be? And that, I think, gives the rendering stage much more direction than just blindly copying what you see. So as you can see, I'm just moving through each part of the picture and trying to refine the form. So I did this leg here, I just went in and tried to fine tune a bit the occlusion shadows where two forms are meeting, the transitions, put a bit of these transitional values here in the leg in where the knee is, and just kind of refine the whole thing, keep refining it. And then I moved into the rear leg here. For the rear leg, again, I don't want to actually render that detailed, so I decided to keep it a bit more graphic. So I just outlined the shadow shape and the light shape, and now I'm just adding in cast shadows on the bottom of the figure, so the shadow that's created by the form casting a shadow on the floor. And obviously with each time I go through the image and pick an area and improve it a little bit, step by step, the image starts to look more and more sophisticated as well. Because you have to remember that every mark you make is almost like depicting a thought you had. And obviously, the more time you spend on the drawing, the more these little thoughts add up and start describing quite nicely what you're seeing and what you think is worth bringing up in the picture. And that comes through more and more as you spend more time. And obviously you want to be a bit careful that you don't over model certain areas that are not relevant. So it's also important to know when to stop at some point. But at the moment, I still see a lot of stuff that I can improve, essentially. All right, as you can see, like as I keep building on it, it keeps coming up to the front more and more. And you can start adding little like textural details in the hair where you just indicate it with some more dynamic, chaotic marks. And that's another way you in the end can create contrast. You know, the form that you want to feel very round and smooth, you just keep smooth, and then the other areas where it makes sense, you can make them a bit more textural, and that again also creates a contrast. But yeah, I can obviously keep going here for a while, and I might actually, and you'll see the final image on the blog. But I think I think it's enough for you to see the point of the rendering phase. And again, I think the biggest hacks for the rendering phase, in my opinion, are not rendering everything, but instead reconnecting to the composition that you planned in the beginning, reconnecting to what do you want the focal point to be, and then to really think, how do you want the viewer to flow through the image, and how can you create a flow like that through your rendering, and then really the process for me at least is to start refining a little bit the focal point in terms of the edges, in terms of the modeling with a light pencil, maybe an HB, and then start darkening the background, darkening what you want to have a two-value read in the end, and that then creates this feeling of form where the very dark masses recede in the shadows. Your focal point and the form, they come to the front because they're lighter, and then you have a lot of value contrast to actually model the lighter forms. And then from there you just create more value range, more gradations, more range in your edges. So you move out from the focal point, you refine everything a little bit, but the further you move out, the less refined it is. And then you can even have certain areas blend in with the background, for example, the head, while others can come to the foreground, etc., etc. And that's a little bit how you then start building up the form. And if I would push it further now, I would probably make the background much, much darker, just because this will make all the rest pop a lot more. So I'll probably spend a little bit more time on that once the camera is off. And then, as I again increase the value range, I'll have a bit more, I'll be able to see a bit more clearly my lighter forms, and it will be easier for me to add nuances there. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. Once again, having a great drawing process, or having a drawing process in general that allows you to make errors and easily correct them, that allows you to create a sense of realism, but at the same time also use your emotions and your sense for aesthetics and your sense for design, so that you have the right balance between realism and creating a well-designed image is really important. And then lastly, of course, the process you use should be one that's fun. And a fun drawing process in the end is one that creates the results that you want consistently, and that just suits your personal drawing style very well. And that is something you'll have to experiment with over time. Look at certain artists, look at different artists, try and analyze their process. What do they start with? You can even learn from other mediums like painting. What is, a process in alla prima oil painting, for example? How can you adapt it to your drawing, etc. And then over time, with some experimentation, you'll come up with something that works for you. But yeah, I hope this tutorial gave you a great starting point, so you can start with a sketching phase, figure out the drawing, then do a composition phase, plan the image, plan your two-value read, plan your linear composition, and then start doing a lay-in. During the lay-in phase, already work on actually the shape design, the rhythms, how it flows, reconnect to the composition and the frame, and then slowly build it up and start rendering in the way that I already summarized. And yeah, I think you'll find that that process will get you started. And then I think really I hope the biggest takeaway from this tutorial is that you just realize that you start paying attention to your process, because most people, when they draw, either they just jump in or they just have a meticulous copying process, but they don't really think of process as something that can free them to find a balance between rendering realistically and actually designing an abstract picture. That's and a process that's fun. So I hope I hope that tutorial showed you that, and the article as well. And yeah, see you in the next next video. Bye bye.